Writing a critical analysis paper, specifically on literature. You can do critical analyses of film in all kinds of genres, but we'll be focusing obviously specifically on literature. So right now I'm going to take the first part of the lesson, and take you through the steps I use when I do my own writing, my own analysis of literature that over my years of experience I've come to learn are the fundamental aspects of writing great literary analysis. So these are my tips, my suggestions on how to write a great paper for the upcoming assignment. This first slide are the steps I recommend for the writing process. So start your paper well in advance of the due date. All great writing requires great revision. Some pieces are written very quickly, such as Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. She composed that in 6 weeks, but I had imagined she still went through some revision. And we're not all Mary Wollstonecraft, myself included. So the biggest lesson I've learned over the years is that all good writing takes good revision. So write multiple drafts. Reread your first draft before writing the second draft. So at this point in the course, look ahead to the paper, see the requirements, decide what you want to write on, and write an early draft where you give yourself a week or 4 or 5 days, some significant amount of time in between the composition of that first draft and the turning in of the final draft, so that you're able to do these next few things. Take several days off between finishing the first draft and rereading it. Let it cool off, give it a break. Take a day or so where you do other things, do your job you have outside school, work on assignments for other classes, go to a movie, whatever it is. But take some time off so that you have a fresh, more objective perspective when you go back and start working on that second draft. Here's the most important tip. Make the conclusion to your first draft the introduction to your second draft. You might have a confused expression on your face right now. I did the first time a professor suggested this to me. What it really means is we often discover what we're trying to argue, what we're trying to say through the process of writing. It's just part of the nature of the writing process. We grapple through, struggle through our ideas. So along those lines, no matter how good our initial thesis is and how much of the paper we have planned out, how well we think we've framed it, we're inevitably going to learn more about what we're trying to say by writing that first draft. So when you go into your second draft, look at your conclusion and see what it is you're ultimately saying at the end of the paper. Try to state that earlier and then revise accordingly so that everything links up. I can't stress how important this is. There have been so many papers I've graded over my 10 years of grading student writing where I'm struggling through the paper, I'm not confused what the student is trying to say, and then I get to the conclusion and they have the most brilliant conclusion. And I'm like, this is what the paper was about. But in academic writing, you want to know that information up front. And I can't tell you how many professors have told me over the years, this is a good paper, especially at the end, but you clearly didn't go back and revise once you figured out what you were trying to say. So don't fail in the way I did so many times as an undergrad and in my first years of grad school. Once you know what you're trying to say, go back, state it earlier, and revise accordingly. In addition to writing multiple drafts and revising once I figure out my main idea, the next best thing I've learned is to have others read your writing. Writing is something by its nature we do in isolation, but we can't be successful at it if we only do it in isolation. I struggled and almost failed out of grad school when I was getting my PhD because I was not having others read my writing before I turned it into professors. So go to the Writer's Center, ask friends and family, ask your classmates in this class, whoever you can find, to read your writing. Writing is a very personal thing. We become attached to a writing, whether we like it or not. And we ultimately, no matter what we do, we can't be as objective as we need to be to get the critical feedback we need to improve. So you have to find an impartial, objective person, maybe someone who doesn't have a ton of knowledge, regarding what you're writing about so that they can really point out to you where your ideas are unclear and you can work on improving those areas of the paper and making your thoughts clear. The next most important tip is think about audience. Audience, audience, audience. Audience is everything. When I almost failed out of grad school, I got help from others. They read my writing, they gave me suggestions and feedback, and I was able to see how other people other than myself perceived my writing, and this was key to my turnaround. Once I started revising, having others read my writing, I started doing much better. My advisor told me, "You're doing well now because you're writing for readers rather than yourself." So, audience is everything. Think about how someone else is going to perceive what you're writing. And I think I've already said this, but write multiple drafts. Try to do at least 2, maybe 3 drafts before you turn in that final draft. An initial very rough draft where you figure out your ideas, a second draft where now that you've figured out your ideas, you polish it up some, have that good thesis at the beginning, have everything consistent. Then have others read that second draft so they can point out what you've still missed. Then polish it up more, fix the areas that are unclear based on this feedback, and turn in a third and final draft to Canvas. These are my tips now for the writing process, especially. Now what I'm going to do is take you through each specific aspect of the paper, looking at a successful student example from a past class. So that you get to know the intricacies of writing, specifically in the literary analysis genre, as well as some of the features of that genre that are unique to it, such as literature review and cultural context that you may not have done when writing another genre. First, we're going to talk about a thesis statement. What should a thesis statement have? This is one of these moments where I'm going to go through here. I'm going to pose questions about writing. You could pause the lecture, try to answer those questions yourself. See how closely your answers match up to what I then cover when you unpause the lecture. I think that would be a good way of learning more about how to do these things. So what should a thesis statement have? Should be clear, succinct, and as specific as possible. Get to the point, say it directly, tight, narrow focus. A lot of students I find want to impress their professors with using big words. It's not necessarily a bad idea, but in reality, we're going to be much more impressed if you can just clearly and directly state what you're saying. I can't tell you how hard it is to state something clearly and directly when we have these big ideas in literary analysis. That's why we need others to read our writing. It has to be a clear stance. It can't just be a fact. It has to be an interpretation, what you believe the message is of the literature, what it's saying. It should be a somewhat unique, original, creative argument. In other words, you can have something that's clearly a stance or an argument, but if you do a little bit of research, you'll find out people have been saying that about the text for 20 years. So when we talk about research in the next section, you'll see how you can put your own spin on it. Finally, state it clearly and directly in the final sentence of the introduction. We're going to look at how to structure introductions on the next slide. But if you open with a thesis, you'll lose your reader. You need a little bit more general background before you get to that specific thesis. And if it's buried in the middle of the intro, you'll lose your reader. They won't be able to follow your train of thought. So a really clear statement of your thesis right at the end of the intro. They'll know exactly what you're trying to say as they then read the rest of the paper. That's so helpful. It's a great signpost. I can't stress how important that is to the reader, to keeping your reader's attention. So the things you shouldn't do then are the opposites of these. Don't be vague or general, as specific as possible in your thesis. Don't state facts or outline the paper. I can't tell you how many papers I read that say, this essay will explore, and then it lists a few things. That's not a thesis. There may be thesis type arguments buried within that list of subtopics, but if you're just saying I'm going to do this, that's not an argument about what the literature means. Finally, try to avoid reiterating common arguments, Jane Eyre is about feminism. Well, yes, it is, and that's an argument. But be more specific. How is it about feminism? What specifically is it saying about feminism? So you'll find there'll be very general topics, and then through research, you can delve in deeper and find nuances or details that other scholars haven't addressed yet and carve out your own niche within that topic. Before we move on to talking about how to do that, let's look at some examples of a thesis. So here's a really weak thesis. Shakespeare's Hamlet is a play about a young man who seeks revenge. Pause the lecture. Why is that bad? Well, it's bad because it just states a fact. It's Everyone knows the play's about revenge. You're not teaching us anything new. You could take a stance on what it says about revenge. When I teach Hamlet, I ask students, does this play condone revenge or not? That's a central question to interpreting and understanding Hamlet. And if you say yes or no to that question, you're getting yourself closer to a thesis. Here's a stronger example. Hamlet experiences internal conflict because he is in love with his mother. Pause it. Why is it good? I'm not a big fan necessarily of this argument, but it is very clearly an argument. It is supported by evidence from the text. Not everyone agrees on this, myself included, but it is a very clear stance. And you can support it with evidence from the text. So that's an important thing I should mention here. I'm not going to agree with every argument you make. I don't need to. What I need to see is that you've thoroughly read the literature, you've pulled some quotes from it, and the language of the literature proves your argument, whether I like your argument or agree with it or not. That's all I care about. I'm not going to dismiss an argument because I don't agree with it. I'll dismiss it if you don't support it. You could have an argument I 100% agree with, but if you don't have the textual evidence to back it up, that's still a failing. So, a clear, debatable stance on the meaning of the literature. Right, I'd like to real quickly before we move on go through the entire layout of the introductory paragraph, culminating in the thesis to emphasize what I said earlier about it needing to be at the end of the intro. So it's great to open with a hook. A hook can be catchy or clever, doesn't have to be. What a hook really is more general background. A thesis, as I've said multiple times, needs to be very specific. So you move from the general to the specific. You start too specific, your reader doesn't know what you're talking about. You start more general, you might intrigue their interest. You can slowly, throughout that intro, transition to the more specific thesis. Here's from the student paper on Dracula, which is a novel at the very end of the Victorian period. Fatal disease was an immutable fact of life in the late 19th century. Despite the exponential growth in scientific and medical knowledge, mankind was still largely helpless against the ravages of contagion. So it's very general. It's not super clever, but it still draws the reader in. It starts with a fact, not an argument, but a fact that's pretty interesting. Some people might not know, and then it shows why it's important that mankind was struggling against fighting viruses at this time. Next, you have the bridge. So, like I said, you start with general background to then lead into your thesis. You have to build a bridge to it. So you get not as specific as the thesis, but slightly more specific. So she goes on to then talk about the specific author after this very general opening two sentences. And in the middle of the intro, she says, the effects of ill health made a lasting impression on Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula, which is evident in the many similarities between Stoker's Dracula and disease. Through scientific research, we know that viruses are uniquely destructive pathogens that employ a sinister method of replication. By injecting their genes into the living cells of organisms, they essentially hijack those cells and turn them into virtuous virus factories. So, very general introduction to disease during the Victorian period, transition to how disease specifically affected Stoker, a little bit of context specifically on a more specific idea of a virus to build up to the thesis, very specific. So with that bridge in place, you then go to the really specific thesis, Her thesis is, this essay specifically explores the parallels between Stoker's famous vampire and viral replication. Is this a good thesis? Why or why not? Pause the lecture and think about it. I've included it as an example. Why is it good? You clearly know what the paper is about, and it sounds like it could be an argument. The bad, it's not stated as an argument. It's one of those theses where it just outlines what you do in the paper. You can infer from this an argument, but the reader has to stop and think about what exactly the argument is. The reader has to go, oh, she's saying what Dracula does is really similar to viral replication. She says she's going to talk about these two things and they're connected, but it's not a direct statement of that connection. So how could it be improved? Here's an example. Bram Stoker's Dracula makes clear parallels between the eponymous vampire and viral replication. Eponymous is just a way of saying the title character. So anyway, what I'm saying here is that this is basically the same thing, but it's stated as an argument instead of a list of what you're going to do. No one cares about what you're going to do. You have to make them care about your argument so they then read what you do. So you have to state your argument. Don't beat around the bush. Be as clear, direct, and explicit as possible. All right, so we've got a good overview of an introductory paragraph. What comes next? Well, it's what I said earlier about finding your own niche so that your thesis is unique rather than generic. And the best way to do that, really the only way to do that, is by looking at what people have already said about that text and carving out your own unique space in that conversation. We call this particular style of writing a literature review. Almost every academic article you look at, especially on literature, after the introduction will have a literature review where they cover the literature, the things that have already been written on the text you're studying. So a literature review is a short section of the paper that outlines the current scholarly conversation on your topic and then explains how your paper adds something to that conversation. I think the word conversation is a great metaphor here. It's kind of like being in a party and you walk by a couple people or a few people having a conversation, and their conversation intrigues you, but you're kind of entering in the middle of it. So you listen for a few minutes. Once you hear what you have to say, you say, well, that's really interesting, but I think this. That's what you do in a literature review. So the purpose here is to show that you're engaging in an important field of study. The body of research that already exists shows that your topic matters, but more importantly, you're entering into that field, you're adding to it. So that, well, that's interesting, but you're showing why your opinion matters. If you're at a party and you say, well, that's interesting, but, and then you just restate what someone else said without adding anything new, people are going to look at you like you're crazy, trying to show off or something. So if you add something new, then that's worth reading. And you show how that thing is new, how your idea is new, and how it's worth reading through the literature review. This is really important. I can't tell you how many times I've asked students, why do you use secondary sources? And they say, to back up my argument. No, if this were a test, that'd be an F. You don't use them to back up your argument, because if they're saying the exact same thing, there's no point in writing your paper. Someone else has already written it. So what you do with secondary sources is you establish a precedent of talking about a specific topic, say disease and Dracula, but then more importantly, you show this is what I am saying about disease and Dracula, and this is why you should read my view on it. Where do we put this in the paper? After the intro, you want the reader to know what your argument is. If you just start talking about these other scholars, they're not going to know why. But before you get into your analysis of the literature, you want to kind of clear the ground. You want to get all of this is what other people have said, this is what I'm saying, all that out of the way, so that you can then eventually just get into your analysis without distracting readers by quoting sources. So set it up with a thesis in the intro, but then clear all this ground before you move into your own analysis to prove your thesis. Let's look at the sample. Literature reviews are hard to write. I picked this paper because I think it has a very good literature review from a student. The opening sentence of her paragraph is really great. Recently, critics have begun to analyze the scientific relevance of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Boom, you know that's the start of a literature review. There's no confusion about what this paragraph is doing because the opening sentence says, recently critics, so she's now talking about what other scholars are talking about. And then she identifies their subject to scientific relevance to Dracula. Opening sentences of paragraphs as well as paragraph breaks are like signposts. They guide the reader through the paper and signal the reader what you're doing. You don't want to beat around the bush. You want that opening sentence of a paragraph to signal exactly what you're doing so they know why they're reading that paragraph. You don't do that, they won't be able to follow your train of thought. This phrase here, recently critics, signals this paragraph, is about the research. She then goes on to say, Carla Edwards uses sociobiology to explain our visceral fear of vampirism, highlighting our evolutionary drive for survival. So what this is a really succinct paraphrase of a source's argument of this scholar, Carla Edwards. So you don't need to quote a bunch from your sources. The literature review can be brief. It can be a page or so or less, even a paragraph. And when you explain what others are saying, it's best to paraphrase in your own words. You can quote some, especially if they're short quotes, but the more of the paper is in your own words, the easier it'll be for the reader to read. And you want to quote the literature, don't get me wrong, but when you're quoting academic articles, it's easy to lose your voice. And so you want your voice to be clear, and then moreover, you want to show you understand what these articles are saying. And so paraphrasing their argument is good. It also helps you keep the paragraph short, succinct. It helps keep things moving. This is a good example of a student who clearly read, an academic article and understood the argument and can articulate it in their own words. So if you're following along with the sample paper, which I should have said, pause the lecture, open the sample paper. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that. You'll see how the student then continues to do this type of thing throughout the rest of the literature review paragraph. But then the final two sentences of the paragraph are important. She says in the second to last sentence, scientific critical literature acknowledges the connections between Dracula and disease. So that's a summary kind of sentence that synthesizes together all the articles. So I believe at this point she's talking about 3 articles. This then ties them all together in one sentence. We call this a critical consensus or an overview of what all the sources have said. And this is really important because you want to show how you're engaging in that conversation. You need to be able to sum up the conversation in one sentence. And I use the word synthesis there to emphasize the importance of you're bringing together what a few people have said, not just what one person has said, which is what the previous example did. In the final sentence, she says, in this paper, I go a step further and propose that Dracula's innate behavior bears an extraordinary resemblance to that of viruses. So, disease, science, people have talked about those things in Dracula. A virus is a specific type of disease. So, with her thesis, she goes slightly more specific. And what she's saying here is that we've talked about disease and science plenty. There's a specific aspect of that, viruses. People haven't really talked about that, and it's very important. So I'm going to talk about that now. And this phrase, I go a step further, shows how she's adding to this conversation. She hooks the listeners at the party. She's not just repeating the same arguments about disease and science. She's taking a specific tact within those broad fields that's been overlooked. So that's the type of move you need to make in the literature review to show how your thesis is unique. Where do you find these sources to quote? Or not to quote, but to include in your paper? EW Library is the best place. So on their homepage, click on databases A to Z. Here's the link to that. MLA is the best one for literature. It's going to be the most comprehensive, most up to date. If you search for your text in MLA, you're going to be able to find everything published on it. JSTOR is also very good. What people like about JSTOR is everything is full text, so you can get the full text PDF of the article right away. The problem with JSTOR is it's too comprehensive. It's not specific to literature, so you're going to have to do a little more filtering of the results. But then on the other hand, it's also not as comprehensive because it excludes things that aren't available full text. So you can use it, but you need to be aware of those deficiencies. MLA is going to be the most comprehensive in terms of literature. You won't miss anything. The only drawback to MLA is not everything is full text. So you have to do interlibrary loan, find it another way. But especially if it's an article, interlibrary loan you usually can get in a day or two once you click interlibrary loan and fill out that request. Librarians can help you with any of that stuff. They're very available, very helpful at EWU. All right, how to search for sources. This may be review from what you've learned in your English 101 and 201 classes. Ideally, it should be. Hopefully you remember this stuff, but just in case, I think I still need to cover it anyway, real briefly. You want to have a research question. So I'm guessing this student's research question was potentially something like, what is the relationship between vampirism and Dracula and disease? You can't just type in your research question. You'll either get too many sources or not enough, because it'll either find just those exact words together or everything that has any of those words. So you need to extrapolate key terms from your research question. So 1 or 2 or 3 word phrases. So I would put in Stoker, Dracula, and disease. You also want to use synonyms. A lot of people may have written on disease and Dracula, but not necessarily used that word. They might have said illness or virus, so that's when you click or and put in some other similar terms to make sure you get all the results to filter through. If you use phrases more than one word that are supposed to be together, say for instance Victorian illness, you want to put that in quotes because you don't want to find every article that talks about Victorian and every article that talks about illness. You just want to find the articles that talk about illness in the Victorian period. So you need those quotes to find that phrase together. Finally, again with the idea of not missing anything, an asterisk, if you put that at the end of a word, it'll find anything that starts with that. So, you can make illnesses plural and not have to search for it singular and plural just by putting that asterisk at the end. The English language has all kinds of suffixes, so those asterisks are clutch when doing research. All right, the next thing here is how do you then take the research and turn it into a thesis? How did the student get the kind of good thesis she has from doing research, right? You've got a broad interest in Dracula, say disease. How do you narrow that? Well, you narrow it by looking at the research. But how do you come up with a thesis after looking at research? That's not necessarily an obvious transition. So for developing the research question, which is the start of the process, you go to your threads and thesis. That's why I assign the threads and thesis. You've got sample thesis statements as well as all these interesting threads to work with. The thesis statements probably need revision, but they can be a good starting point. So from there, develop a research question. You might have a thread, vampirism and Dracula seems reminiscent of disease. That thread then becomes a research question you ask. What I want to find out by doing my research is what is the relationship between vampirism and Dracula and disease. So once you have your question, you do the research by extrapolating those key terms and searching for articles with those key terms. Once you've read a lot of that research and worked your way through it, you have enough knowledge of the subject. You then spend a number of hours reading those articles, skimming them. You become an expert, so to speak, on disease and Dracula. Once you're an expert on that by reading the research, you turn your question into a position. That's the next key step. So vampirism functions like a disease in Dracula. That's what I've learned. That's what their connection is they're very similar. But that's too general. So you need to keep working and then really narrow your position. So virus is more specific than disease because a virus works a specific way. Now I've got something really specific I can go through in my paper. Okay, so that's how to do the research, how to develop that thesis from it. Once you have your thesis, you can then write your literature review, which we just talked about. What's the next section of the paper? I call this the cultural context section, and like the literature review, this may be very new to you. It's a short section of the paper that outlines pertinent historical or cultural context necessary for the reader to understand your argument. In other words, if you're talking about virus and Dracula, your reader is going to be wondering uh, what was happening with viruses in the Victorian period at that time. Um, so, what do you put in this? Well, you basically just give a brief overview of a cultural trend or phenomenon from the time period. So, you explain in like a paragraph, you just kind of give an overview of what was happening with viruses at the time. Some examples of things we've studied in this class would be the slave trade, the Victorian crisis in faith, the imperial expansion of the Victorian Empire, um, the rise of the print culture in the Victorian period, where everybody was writing and publishing journals and newspapers, etc. So, some kind of cultural thing that was going on that informs your analysis, your argument. So, you take a minute, take like a short paragraph, and explain that. Again, you usually need to cite some sources, just like in the lit review, to help you explain what you're saying here. In this case, to kind of back up or to help give the overview of what you're saying. So these are different kinds of sources, though. They're primary sources because you're not analyzing what people have said before about the literature, and when they're interpreting it, you're here more teaching your audience about a certain time period of which they may not be familiar. So we'll talk in a minute about primary sources and what those are. Where does this go in the paper? Usually after the lit review, you want thesis, lit review, cultural context. Because if you go into the cultural context with just an intro and a thesis, readers usually don't have a robust enough understanding of your argument to get why you're giving them all this cultural context. So you need to do the lit review first. But just like the lit review before the body of the paper, you don't want to be messing around with all this historical background. You want to just be able to analyze the literature once you get to the body of the paper. Let's look at the sample here. I am not suggesting that Bram Stoker had a preternatural understanding of viral replication. The existence of viruses had only begun to dawn on the scientific community in 1892, 5 years before Dracula was written. So this, again, clearly signals what the paragraph is about. You're going to learn about what people thought of viruses at the time Stoker wrote the novel. There's that exact phrasing. It's like I planned it. At that time, the medical profession was still unable to accurately distinguish viruses from bacteria, as evidenced by this person and the British Journal of Medicine in his article, set up for a quote. So here you have that primary source being quoted to help give the overview. And then she ends the paragraph by saying, "It is therefore striking that as Stoker wrote about Dracula, he was unwittingly describing the nature of viruses and their behavior, something that would not be understood for another 4 decades." So this sentence makes more sense if you've read the whole paragraph. Hopefully you've done that looking at the sample paper. But the idea here is she then connects all this cultural background she spent the last paragraph overviewing to the novel. So we see, okay, Stoker was plugged into something culturally going on. I now know what that is. I can understand the analysis better. So these primary sources, she's quoting something from 1892, which is a great way to give insight into what was going on in the 1890s when Stoker wrote Dracula. But how do you find a source from 1892? The best place for this class is the Norton Anthology. Because it has all of these sections set aside just to give cultural context. So in the volume E here, the Victorian volume, there's this entire Victorian issues section that's pages about 600 to 700 that covers 5 major issues. So anything from there would be a primary source. The report on child labor from the Elizabeth Barrett Browning lecture is the best example, but anything, or Darwin, anything from any of those sections would work. We read some of those sections when we were studying the Romantics as well. So there's lots there for you to pull from. But anything published or written 15 years before or after the literary work counts. So there are other places you can find that. You can look on Google Books and Project Gutenberg, but unless you have a specific text in mind, you can't really just search there. If this were an upper division class and I like a 400 level seminar, a senior class, I mean, it is an upper division class, but a senior class, I'd probably be asking you to do more primary research and giving you more specific places to find that stuff. But I think for this class, you can use what's in the anthology and then prior knowledge. If you have any questions about this, just let me know and I can help you find stuff. So the literature review is secondary sources, the cultural context is primary sources. What are these things really? A primary source was written or published the same time as the literary text, and the reason it's there is to give us insight to what was going on at that time. A secondary source is what you write for the class. It's an analysis of the literature, so that's published today, looking back, analyzing. Okay, we're almost done here. We've covered probably what's new to you, but I want to make sure you really know how to write literary analysis. So we're going to go through the body of the paper. Let me be really clear in this moment. Pay attention right here. The introduction, the literature review, the cultural context, that's all clearing the ground. The most important part of the paper is what we're going to talk about now, the actual analysis of the literature. So this should be the majority of your paper. You should have a number of paragraphs, probably at least 3 or 4, that follow the structure I'm about to cover here. What's really important is that you just focus on the literature. The only quotes in this section should be from the literature. You should quote a lot from the literature and analyze those quotes. But you don't want to be going through your primary and secondary sources here. You want to have cleared all that ground before you get to that section. If you're analyzing Dracula or The Signal Man or Manfred or any work, you don't want to interrupt that and quote from other scholars other than yourselves. You're scholars because you're in this class. Um, so that'll just be distracting. Here you want to present your argument. You've done all that clearing of the ground to show where your argument belongs and what it adds. Now prove your argument by analyzing the literature. That's all you do here. So each body paragraph should have a structure with 4 things. A clear topic sentence that states the argument of the paragraph in its opening sentence. I can't stress how important it is. I read so many paragraphs that do have a clear argument, but they state it at the middle or the end. I don't know why I'm reading that paragraph. In other genres, you can build up to your argument, but in academic writing, you present your argument first and then prove it. Think of it like being in a courtroom. You don't, if you're a prosecutor, you don't wait till the end to say this person is guilty. The very first thing you say is this person is guilty. Then you show all the evidence. That's kind of what you do in academic writing. You can make this a topical transition. In other words, you have several subtopics, and each one is the subject of its own body paragraph, and these subtopics are the way you prove your thesis. That should be pretty familiar to you. You've been writing papers for a number of years. One of the hardest parts of writing, I struggle with this all the time, is transitions. How do you make it flow smoothly and not just feel like an arbitrary structure where you're just talking about these things in an order? But why are you talking about them in that order? So if they're all proving your thesis, they're related in some way. So you have these topic sentences, you know what that is. So you're starting a new paragraph. You can look at the topic of that paragraph. What's its relationship to the topic of the previous paragraph? Make that clear in that opening sentence as well. Your transitions will flow more smoothly. We call that a topical transition to show because it shows the connections between the topics of the paragraph. So what comes next after that opening sentence where you state your argument? Maybe a little bit of context, but pretty soon a quote from the literature that can act as evidence to prove the claim. So the quote itself doesn't prove your claim, but it's there so that you can prove your claim. Next, and most importantly, a thorough analysis of the quote to show readers how it proves the claim from your topic sentence. Sorry for the typo. So the quote itself doesn't prove your claim. Again, like proving something in a courtroom, you don't say, this gun has the fingerprints on it. You say, this gun has the fingerprints on it, and that's important because, and you explain its importance. So you want to provide a few sentences, probably at least 3 or 4 sentences in your own words for every quote from the literature to show the connection to that idea. How does it prove that idea? Finally, at the end of that paragraph, just a nice concluding sentence to tie everything together. Through your analysis, you probably covered a lot of ground. You want to end on a cohesive note rather than just your last analytical statement, so that this paragraph is this nice present wrapped up for the reader because it all fits together. Some tips here: avoid plot summary. You might need a little bit. You don't want to assume your reader knows everything, but just that's the criterion to gauge it. What does my reader need to know about the plot to understand this argument? Be as succinct and brief as possible with plot summary. Also, don't analyze plot. Stick to close reading. Even if you're writing good analysis in it, but it's of plot, it's of events, it's not really going to prove your argument. The language, the words from the literature are the best way to prove your argument because this is a literary studies class, and we call analysis of language from literature close reading. Hopefully, I've been demonstrating it in my lectures. That's one of my goals, but that's what we call it, and that's how you prove your arguments. So let's go through one body paragraph from the student paper to see this. So the topic sentence: just as a virus spreads throughout a population through human contact, Dracula plans to expand his vampirism into England through contact with English people. Great sentence. This is so clearly an argument. Some people would disagree with this. It clearly relates to the thesis. That's one thing I forgot to mention on the last slide is you want these subtopics and through your analysis to show that they connect with your thesis. They're proving your overall thesis. The paper should feel like it all fits together like a jigsaw puzzle. You've got 4 or 5 pieces, you put them together. Those are your subtopics. They come together and form your thesis. So this clearly relates to your thesis, but it's so clearly an argument. I have no question what this paragraph is about when I read it. Here's a quote that talks about Dracula killing people on the boat on the way to England. Here's her analysis. Dracula's entrance to England by ship is the reminiscent of the way many deadly illnesses have reached the island over the centuries, killing the people on board during transit. So this shows how the language proves the thesis. That's exactly what you need to do. It's almost like an equation. Thesis of the paragraph. A topic sentence is like a mini thesis. So claim or thesis of the paragraph, evidence, explanation of the evidence. That's what you need. This paragraph ends too quickly would be one critique I have of this student paper. There should be a few more sentences explaining the quote. But she does do that in later paragraphs. And this one sentence of analysis is a great example of how to do close reading. Finally, the conclusion. This slide, much like actual conclusions, will be short but sweet. I can't tell you how many papers I see with these really long conclusions that are longer than body paragraphs, and I'm just stumped. The conclusion should be the shortest paragraph in the paper. The only reason it's there is so that you don't end with your last thought, but that you tie all your thoughts together, again, wrapping the paper up like a nice present for the reader. That's the only reason why it's there. Do that and get out quickly. So only 3 things at most should be in the conclusion. Restate your argument, make connections between your ideas, and then the so what factor. The so what factor is important. I remember one of my first papers in grad school, I made connections between these different things, and I thought it was so cool, this argument I had, and I showed the teacher, and she said, yeah, that's really interesting, that's cool you've done that, but why does it matter? So what's relevant? I think we can clearly see here, the Victorians battling contagions and Dracula representing that's a pretty important topic. History of health, medicine, how it relates to the time period. So show how your argument's important, why it matters. You can do that all throughout, but the conclusion is a great place to do that because you'll leave an impact on the reader. The point I really want to emphasize before we end this overly long lecture, and I apologize for how long it is and how long it'll make lecture 5, but I really think you should know all of this about your papers before you go to write them. Um, the one thing I really want to emphasize here is the point number 2, making connections between your ideas. The reason I see conclusions that are way too long all the time is that students recap every single subtopic for the reader. They literally have 4 or 5 sentences in the middle of their conclusion that are just, restatements of all the topic sentences throughout the paper. You can have 5 sentences that state different topics, but if you're just doing each one individually, there's no connection. Whereas you can have one sentence that ties together those different ideas, like the type of synthesis statement we saw in the literature review, but with your own ideas. So you don't need to restate every single subtopic. What you can do, if you need to, if you have space in the conclusion, is tie them together. Um, Ending on a cohesive note is the most important thing to do in the conclusion. That's why it's there, but you can do that shortly and sweetly. You don't need to recap everything to do that. So hopefully that gives you some new insights about conclusions. Hopefully this whole lecture really helps you to write good papers. That was my goal. I appreciate you taking the time to listen. I'm excited to move on and talk about the literature.